Okay, so we're here today to talk about evolution. So this is going to be the first video in our unit about evolution. And in this video, we're going to discuss what is evolution, who came up with it, talk about him a little bit, his discoveries, and then talk about natural selection. So that's the goal for this video. So when we're talking about evolution, we have to talk about Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin is known as the father of evolution. He came up with the theory of evolution. Evolution means that things change over long periods of time. So over long periods of time, organisms change. He did all of his work way back in the 1800s, so quite a while ago, and his overarching theory is that his idea was that evolution, which is change over long periods of time, happens due to natural selection. Natural selection is essentially survival of the fittest, and we're going to talk about that a bit more in detail later on. So Darwin, again known as the father of evolution, he got most of his data in experiments that he did when he traveled around the world on his boat, the HMS Beagle. He made many observations about the natural world and organisms while on his journey. However, most of his data about evolution came from his stop in the Galapagos Islands. So he sailed all around the world, and most of his information was collected in the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are quite unique because the Galapagos Islands has organisms that live nowhere else in the world, so they're unique to the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands are located, if we look over here on the map, right here, so just off the coast of South America. Like I said, he sailed all over. If you see the red lines show where he journeyed. And he stopped way over here in the Galapagos Islands. And what he noticed is that the animals there, they were unique for the island and they lived nowhere else in the world, but they did resemble or look similar to organisms that lived on the mainland in South America. So he noticed organisms on the Galapagos Islands were unique and did not live anywhere else in the world, but they did resemble those living on the South America mainland. Now, while he was at the Galapagos, he looked at many different species. He looked at turtles, Komodo dragons. I think this next one shows different types of turtles and their necks. But a lot of his main work on evolution came out of the study of finches. It's the most noted one. So a finch is a small bird that lives on the Galapagos Islands. He saw that there were 14 different species of finches living on the island. Now, for him, this was quite puzzling because the place where the birds would have migrated from, being South America, on South America, there was only one species of finch. So only one species of finch in South America, and these finches had to migrate from South America. But somehow on the islands, there were 14 different species of finches. So he was very curious about this and decided to study it. How did that one species become 14 different ones on the islands? So he started just making observations, and one of the main observations he made was about their beaks. All the birds, all the different species of finches, each species had a unique type of beak. And the beaks correlated to what they ate. So their beak size and shape correlated to what they ate. So all the birds that ate a similar food had a similar beak. And he said that this was due to adaptations from the birds adapting to their food sources. So he said that each species had evolved an adaptation, and an adaptation is a trait that gives an organism an advantage. So each species had evolved an adaptation to make it be more successful based on the food that it ate. So he would notice, let's say the big bird here, the bird with the very thick, very wide, large beak. This bird would eat seeds that were larger and tougher, whereas the little bird would eat the little teeny, fragile seeds from the ground. Um, Other birds may eat a type of small nut or different variations in the seeds all across the island. Some might have eaten insects. But he noticed that with each food source, there was a different species of bird, and that species had a similar type beak. And these beaks allowed the finches to successfully feed because with their unique beak, they were able to eat their food source. Therefore, they were able to successfully compete. Since there were many different food sources, there were food sources in all different locations and various habitats across the islands. They were able to compete because with all the different food sources, each population of finches was rather small instead of having one huge population. Since they each had their own food source, they were able to successfully compete. And because they were able to do that, they were able to live. Therefore, they were able to reproduce. And when they reproduced, they passed on their successful traits. And over time, this led to differences in beaks that made the birds adapt to the food that they ate. So, and over time, all of these changes led to them being different species. So, his conclusions based on this work was that species are all connected. So the species of finches were connected. And he said this because he knew that the finches had to come from South America. And on South America, there were only one species of finch. Because there was only one species of finch, that species migrated to the Galapagos Islands. Once on the islands, the birds all spread out. Some birds lived in the trees, some on the ground. They lived in various different places. They ate various different foods, whether it was seeds or nuts or insects. And then over time, they slowly adapted to where they were living and what they were eating. And this caused changes over time, changes in their beaks, changes in their behavior, changes in their overall size. Some were smaller, some were larger. And over time, all of these changes compounded until they were all different species. So they started with one species, and over time, these changes compounded to make 14 different species. They evolved apart. So that is Darwin's work with finches and how he came up with the idea of evolution, as well as natural selection or survival of the fittest. The birds that were able to do things successfully were the ones that passed on their traits and lived. So nature chose the best traits. Now, all of his work, it didn't happen all on his own. He had some influences. He looked to scientists who had done work before him. The first scientist that influenced Darwin was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. We're going to refer to him as Lamarck, and he had two theories. Lamarck said that organisms can change based on the use or the disuse of a trait, meaning if you don't use the trait that you have, you will lose it. So for the giraffe neck, if giraffes don't stretch their neck, they will lose the long neck. His other theory was that organisms can pass on acquired traits. So traits that you get during your lifetime, you can pass on to your children. Now, the traits that you get in your lifetime are going to be ones that you have to work to have. So maybe you work out a lot so that you can be extra fit. Lamarck would say if you work out, your kids will be fit because you worked out. You pass those acquired traits on to your kids. Similarly, he would say, if I didn't like my hair color, maybe my natural hair color, I could dye my hair. His idea would insist that that acquired trait of me dyeing my hair, that could be passed to my child. which is not true. If I dye my hair red, I'm not going to pass the trait for red hair to my child because I don't have it in my body to pass down. So obviously, his theories were incorrect. But his idea of looking at how things change over time and how you pass them on got Darwin started for thinking about, well, how do they change over time? How did one species become 14? So he was on to the asking similar questions as Darwin and kind of influenced his train of thought there. The second scientist that influenced Darwin, his name was Lyell. Lyell did work based on land and time. So he realized and wrote about landforms, saying that landforms can change over time. So what that means is one particular area of land can change. It's not always the same. There might eventually be a mountain where there was not a mountain, or an ocean where there was land, or land where there once was an ocean. So land changes over time. And he also said that time on Earth is immense, meaning that the time scale of Earth is very, very, very large. So Earth is 4.65 billion years old. That's very, very large. Now, while this doesn't seem like, well, that's not related to evolution or Darwin, it did kind of give him a bit more to support his idea of the fact that the Galapagos Islands weren't always the same. New habitats can open up, new habitats can disappear, new food sources can emerge, things on land change. And it also gave him the idea that since time is so immense, since Earth has been around that many billions of years, lots of things can change in that huge amount of time. So that helped contribute to his theory a bit as well. And the last scientist we're going to talk about that influenced Darwin is Thomas Malthus. And Thomas Malthus wrote an essay on the principle of populations. So he looked at populations specifically. This was helpful for Darwin because Darwin was looking at populations of finches. So he said that competition in population happens for resources. So within a population, organisms are going to compete for resources. And a population itself is going to be a group of individuals that live in a similar area that can all interbreed and have normal offspring. And he said that in extreme cases, all of this competition can lead to death, disease, war, starvation, and a various number of different factors. And this helped Darwin because, again, Darwin was looking at populations of finches. Instead of having one humongous population of finch, over time, the finches adapted to their different habitats and food sources, and they became 14 different populations or 14 different species. And that took the one huge population that would have been one big species and broke it into 14 other groups, making intense overarching competition less likely. Now, they still have to compete to be successful, but it's not like it would have been had the group been so much larger. So all of this knowledge that Darwin came up with, all of his theories, he wrote a book called On the Origin of Species, and he published that in 1859. You can actually find copies of this book. I actually have a copy in my room. So in his book, he wrote two main ideas that we're going to talk about. The first main idea in his book was descent with modification. So descent with modification, I like to summarize that in my own words, as over time you pass on your traits, but they change based on what's needed during that time. So you pass things on, but they can be modified based on what's needed during that time. So species can change over time. They can give rise to new species. New species can be created, but they do have a common ancestor, meaning that they have a similar point of origin, and over time, changes occurred that caused new species to emerge. And one way that Darwin, as well as other scientists, can study these changes over long periods of time to help support the idea of evolution is by looking at the fossil record. So the fossil record are all the fossils or preserved remains of organisms that were once alive. And typically it's not the whole entire organism. There have been times where there have been entire organisms, but typically it's like the bone structure that can be analyzed from the organism. So you can kind of get an idea of its shape, its bone structure, and some of its general characteristics. And these are found deep within rock. Paleontologists are the scientists that actually study fossils large scale, and new species are still being discovered today. So paleontologists are still looking at various different sites around the world, finding new fossils, finding new species that used to exist. And then these fossils can be used to help determine the structures of organisms from the past and when those organisms may have lived. And there are two ways we're going to talk about on how we can get an idea of when these fossilized organisms would have been alive. The first way that we can get an idea of how old a fossil is by radiometric dating. Radiometric dating is going to give an exact date to a fossil or a specimen. So it tells us the exact date that that organism was alive. And we do that by measuring the amount of radioactive isotope in the sample. So radiometric dating, we measure the radioactivity in a sample to get a date. It's kind of where the idea comes from. So more or less, we have an idea of how long it takes for these isotopes to break down. So we know their half-lives. We know how long it takes for the isotopes to disappear within a sample. So all we have to do is find our fossil, and from that rock sample, we see how much radioactive isotope is in the sample. We compare that to how much is in a more modern sample, and it will tell us how long ago that organism existed, because we know how long it takes for the radioactivity isotopes to break down over time. So measuring that will give us an exact date, because we know exactly how long it takes for the isotope to break down. We can just kind of work backwards to see how old that fossil is. Now, the second type of dating is not exact. It just gives you an idea of what is older and what is newer, and that is called the law of superposition. So when we see superposition, we use the position of the fossil to tell us what is older and what is younger. So more or less, the deeper in the ground you go, the older you get. So the deeper you go, the older the sample is. So essentially, it just tells us a fossil we find near the surface is the youngest. The fossil that we find the deepest is the oldest. So it just gives us a general idea of what is older and what is younger. So it kind of gives us a non-specific timeline, whereas radiometric dating can give a very specific timeline. And this also shows evidence of change in landforms, because sometimes when you're looking through layers of rock, very, very down deep, you could find evidence of organisms that kind of look like fish, and at the top you find things that walk on legs. So you could see that area used to have water and now it does not. So it's kind of interesting that way. So fossils also tell us that today's organisms descended from or came from an ancestral species. So they descended from an ancestral species, meaning that over time changes occurred to that ancestor species. Organisms branched out and became another species, which may or may not be present today. So we can look at, say, if we look at the skeleton of elephants over time, here's a modern elephant, but when we look back using the fossil record, we see small changes in the elephant, and they're similar enough that we know it's related to the modern elephant. But we can see where structurally they are different, therefore they're different species and they existed millions of years ago, but we know that they share a common ancestor due to their physical and chemical similarities. So just a summary of the fossil record itself. The fossil record can tell us that animals and plants have changed over time. Just keep in the back of your head, fossils can be used to look at plants. Plants can be fossilized too. The time span of evolution and the time on Earth is very, very large. It is immense, meaning Earth has been around for a long time. And by looking at fossils, we can see the organisms that used to exist, and it tells us that extinction is the fate of most species that have ever existed, because when we look at the fossil record, we see all of these species that used to exist that don't currently. So we know that extinction happens to most species that have ever existed. And we can also use fossils to tell us how environments have changed over time, and sometimes it's drastic, kind of like in the example where we talked about how an area may have used to have water and now it does not. So that was his first idea, descent with modification. So passing down of traits, but them changing to fit the current need of the area. So that was his first idea. His second idea that he wrote about in his book was that of natural selection. And he said that natural selection is created from variation and competition, and those lead to natural selection, which can be described as survival of the fittest. So the organism that is the most fit for its environment is going to be the one that's going to survive long enough and be able to reproduce, to pass on its successful traits. So he said that there are 4 things that contribute to evolution that make natural selection happen. And those are variation. You have to have variation in order to have natural selection. So that would be like diversity. You have to have overproduction, meaning you have more organisms than your area can support. You have to have competition. And then in the end, therefore, you're going to have reproductive selection. So starting off with variation. Variation means that all organisms within a species are different. So every population has differences amongst its organisms. Therefore, all organisms aren't the same. Some have more beneficial traits than others. So every population has differences. There's diversity. One thing that can contribute to this diversity are mutations. Mutations are going to be changes in DNA, and mutations that happens in a gamete or a sex cell, a sperm or an egg, are going to be the ones that are passed down to offspring. So again, if I have a mutation in my arm isn't making my baby, the sperm and egg are. So only mutations in sperm or eggs are passed down. So you have to have diversity in your population. Mutations can help cause diversity. You also need overproduction. Overproduction means that the organisms there are going to be reproducing more than the environment can support. And that's going to mean that some organisms have to die. So some organisms will not be able to survive because there's not enough resources for them. Some are going to have to die. There's not enough resources for them. And that overproduction is going to lead to competition, because if there's not enough resources, they're going to have to compete. They may be competing for food if there's not enough food. They may be competing for mates to help pass on their genes. They might need to compete for shelter to stay safe. And they also are going to have to evade predators. And those organisms that are able to do all of this successfully, the ones that are able to find food, mate, shelter, and avoid predators, they're going to be considered fit. They have the traits it's needed to survive. Those traits are going to be passed down to their children. And that is what we call selective reproduction, meaning those that are going to be more suited for the environment, the ones that have the traits that are well enough to survive, they're going to be the ones that are going to survive and have more offspring. Therefore, nature has selected them to actually live and reproduce. So that's how nature selects, natural selection, nature selects the best traits. Nature chooses. We don't choose, nature does. And we have two examples to talk about with evolution by means of natural selection. The first one is a historic example, and it's about moths. So this is way back in England in the 1800s. There are two colors of moth. There's the lighter colored moth, and then there's the darker colored moth. Now, on a dark colored tree, a light colored moth will stand out, be seen, and get eaten, whereas the dark colored moth can blend in and be able to survive. So in this situation, it's more beneficial, it's more fit to be a dark colored moth to blend in. Whereas if the trees are lighter in color, it's more beneficial to be a light colored moth so that you can blend in and not be seen, because the dark colored moths are going to be the ones that are going to be seen and get eaten. So what happened throughout history is way back early 1800s, there was low pollution. So there wasn't that much pollution in the air. Because there's not that much pollution, the trees were light in color. Because the trees were light colored, the light colored moths were more likely to survive. So here, the light colored moths were more likely to survive. I'm going to use an up arrow. Because the number of light-colored moths is going to increase, because they're going to be the ones that are surviving. However, in the late 1800s, lots of factories were built. Lots of factories were built that led to soot. Lots of soot, lots of pollution, and that soot and pollution covered the trees. When soot covers trees, the trees are going to become dark in color. And when the trees become dark in color, the dark moths are going to blend in. So now, if you're a light-colored moth, you're going to be the one that gets eaten. So the dark-colored moths are going to go up here. So now we have more dark moths because it's more beneficial to be a dark-colored moth. However, over time, about the time mid-1900s rolled around, people started getting on to the idea that pollution is not good. It's not good for people. It's not good for organisms around us. It's really not good. So humans created clean air laws. The air cleaned up, less soot, less pollution. Then the trees went back to being a lighter color. What happens when the trees become a light in color again? Well, now the light-colored moths are going to be making their comeback, because if you're a light-colored moth, you can survive on the light-colored trees, and you'll be passing on your traits. So over time, the population of moths changed to reflect that of which type of moth was most successful in their environment. A more modern example is that of insecticide or drug resistance. So an insecticide is something that A farmer might spray on their plants so they didn't get insects. Or you spray an insecticide around your house so you don't have bugs. So one thing to know about insecticides is when you spray, inevitably, you're not killing all of them. A couple of them are going to survive. You spray your insecticide, you're going to get most of them. But there's a couple that are going to survive. Those couple that do survive are going to be the ones that are resistant to the spray. They can survive the spray. So the ones that live, they're going to be really happy and they're going to reproduce. But the only reason they can reproduce is because they're resistant to the pesticide. So that's going to be an inherited trait, meaning they're going to be passing that trait down to their bug babies. And if they pass that trait down to their bug babies, that's going to lead to more bugs that are resistant to pesticide. Meaning, the next time you come out, you spray, it's not going to work as well. Less are going to die. The ones that don't die are going to reproduce. And the next time you come back to spray, even less are going to die. And the ones that don't die are going to reproduce. And over time, you're going to be able to spray and none of them are going to die, because over time, the ones that die are going to be the ones that will die because of pesticide. The ones that live can reduce or survive the pesticide. Therefore, they're going to reproduce and pass on their survivability trait. And the similar thing happens with antibiotics. If you get sick with a bacteria, you take an antibiotic, you kill all of the bacteria, even the good ones. But there's going to be some that survive. And the ones that survive are going to be the ones that antibiotics don't kill. Those are going to be the ones that reproduce because they're only ones left. And then over time, antibiotics aren't going to work as effectively because you're going to have more bacteria reproducing that are resistant to the antibiotics. All right, so there's going to be some questions and practice on this on Canvas.